So, on behalf of the American Sephardi Federation, Institute of Jewish Experience, and the Rabbi Arthur Schneier International Program at Yeshiva University, we are very honored today to have Professor Joseph Sassoon. And I will, like I said, please do continue to throw in some comments and questions into the chat. I will hand over the floor to my colleague, Professor Ronnie Perellis, who will do the formal introduction.
Thank you, Drora, and thank you, the Institute for Jewish Experience of the American Sephardi Federation. Wonderful to partner with you again on this series. One of the goals of this series is to bring the world together to show the complexity of the Sephardic world, of the way that people in far off places are connected, and to connect that to our own understanding of our current Jewish history and Jewish reality. And today's guest will be doing this on so many levels, and I'm very, very excited to learn from Professor Sassoon. So without any further ado, let me introduce him formally, and then we'll hear about his new book. Professor Joseph Sassoon is Professor of History and Political Economy and Director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. He's also a Senior Associate Member of St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and a trustee of the Bodleian Library. His previous books include the prize-winning Saddam Hussein's Bath Party, Inside an Authoritarian Regime, The Iraqi Refugees, The New Crisis in the Middle East, and Anatomy of Authoritarianism in the Arab Republics. The book he'll be discussing today is The Sassoons, the Great Global Merchants and the Making of an Empire. Thank you so much, Professor Sassoon.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me, and I really appreciate this opportunity. Let me just share my screen. I have a few slides. Is that clear, everyone? Okay, so this is really kind of the story of one family that left Baghdad in 1830, escaped from there, and there has been many erroneous versions on that it's because of anti-Semitism. It is really not. I ended up researching it also in the Ottoman Empire archives. And the bottom line is governors changed frequently. There was a corrupt governor in Baghdad in 1830 who embezzled money from the Sassoons, who were a very prominent family. By the way, they were prominent not as a trading family, but actually as tax collectors on behalf of the Ottoman emperor in Constantinople. But governors came in and went. One governor was good, another one was corrupt. This one kept embezzling money from merchant families, irrelevant of their religion, to the extent that if a family doesn't pay a ransom, he would arrest a member of the family. There was too much risk. The founder of this dynasty, David Sassoon, left with his elder father and escaped from Baghdad and went to Bushehr in southern Iran. And before I continue, let me just a little bit show you. So this is Baghdad at the time. Actually, according to a rabbi who visited Baghdad in 1824, there were about 6,000 Jewish families and 5 large synagogues in Baghdad at the time of his visit. A traveler estimated 7,000 out of a total of 50,000. So a very high percentage of the population. And he noted the prominent role Jews played in the province. The community, who came to be known as the Babylonian Jewry, possessed its own language called the Baghdadi Jewish, a dialect of Arabic written in Hebrew letters. And of course, the history of the Jews had a continuous presence in Babylon, or what used to be called Mesopotamia, for some 2,500 years, since the forced exile in the 6th century BC, following the conquest of Judea by the Babylonians. There were really thriving communities in all cities of what is now called Iraq, and probably more Jews there than anywhere in the Arab East. Now, the important thing about this language, it really what led me to write this book. I tell the story in the book, in the preface, that I was not really interested in the history of the Sassoons, but I found this incredible trove of documents. This is an example of it. And this is, you need 3 languages. You need the Baghdadi Jewish dialect, which is a specific dialect. Then you need to know Arabic, because this is in actually Arabic, but written in Hebrew letters. And unless you know those 3, you cannot decode it. Plus the handwriting. And there were a lot of words in Persian and Ottoman there, because it was part and parcel of the history of Baghdad when this language. And this language really was what people corresponded in Baghdad. When the Sassoons left and go back from after a year in Bushir, the father died. David Sassoon made an incredible decision. Rather than to go to some country in the Gulf, and there were a lot of Jewish merchants there, or Isfahan in Iran, he decided to go to Bombay because he has heard that there is absolutely no discrimination in Bombay, and that it really depends on how you live and you develop the business. But this language became critical. Remember at the time when people were trading from one place to another, a message like that would take between 3 to 6 weeks to arrive at its destination. Many of the messengers who were carrying these messages ended up selling the information that is about a trading to competitors. Well, guess what? No one could decode this. So the Sassoons had their own system of security in an indirect way. When David Sassoon arrived in Bombay in about 1831, Bombay was quite a small city, but at the same time, quite cosmopolitan. Its inhabitants counted probably no more than 200,000, but very diverse: Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, Armenians, Portuguese, and Jews. There was a Jewish connection with Bombay from the 16th century, as one of the eminent Portuguese traders residing in Bombay was a Jew. But there was really no community until the second half of the 18th century, when 4 different migration came to the city. The first was called Bnei Israel, native Jew caste. The second was Arab Jews from the Ottoman provinces of Baghdad, Basra, and Aleppo. And the third was Cochin Jews from the Malabar coast. And the fourth were Persian-speaking Jews from Afghanistan, Bukhara, and Mashhad in Iran. David was by nature risk adverse. This is all the main family members. David Sassoon, the first, and I'll talk a little bit quickly about the others. He really was risk averse. His family was very important to him. His first wife, with his first wife, he had 2 sons and 2 daughters. She died at a very young age, most probably after the birth of the 4th child, which was kind of normal at the time in the early 19th century. A year later, he married a second wife that they had 10 children. So together he had 14 sons and daughters, and I argue in the book that they were almost a small army. And he created the first network. And one of the things that comes across clearly in the book, that certain things from the 18th, 19th century has not changed in our 21st century. The need for networks and the need for information. And David Sassoon was excellent in developing both. He stayed in Bombay. He knew Arabic, Hebrew, Turkish, and Persian. Remarkably, although from the beginning he decided to ally himself with the British Empire, the only superpower in the 1830s, never learned English. And in fact, in the 1850s, he was granted British citizenship, although he never went to Britain, but it was given to him for his services to the British Empire. He actually could not sign his naturalization certificate in English, but signed it in Hebrew. Interestingly enough, he learned Hindustani, but never bothered to learn English, but made sure that all his children were tutored by proper English teachers. I want to move to, when he died, I'm telling you the story very briefly, and then we'll go to the questions. When he died in 1864, he appointed his oldest son, Abdullah, to become the next chairman. But the second son that you see in the picture, Elias, who actually was the one who developed business in China, refused to accept this. And after 3 years of squabbling, they split. And from 1867, you had two competing firms, both carrying the name Sassoon, David Sassoon and Co., and E.D. Sassoon and Co. One of the most intriguing aspects of this book, in my opinion, is a whole chapter about what I really believe was the only woman who was a CEO of a global trading firm at the end of 19th century. She ran the business from Bombay from 1895 to 1901. And I tell in the book how the men in the family were not happy and never stopped conspiring against her to dethrone her until they succeeded. The last part of the Sassoons, really, when Farha, who everyone, by the way, anglicized their name, Abdullah became Sir Albert because he was knighted. The pushing out of a flora kind signaled the beginning of the end of David Sassoon and Co. E.D. Sassoon, Victor was the great-grandchild of Elias, took it to new heights, but mainly in China, in Shanghai. But of course, that came to an end more or less in 1949 with the nationalization of all assets of the Sassoons. This gives you an idea of the tremendous expansion by the 1860s. I mean, it is really phenomenal how in 30 years, with no trading experience, with not one event that changed David Sassoon, he managed to build this incredible network of agents, of family members. The three stars are the main hubs. The first major hub was Bombay. The second hub was Shanghai. And later on, as more and more people of the family move to London, it becomes the third hub. And the change is really critical. The book is not only about the rise of the Sassoon, but also about the demise of the dynasty, why it happened, the loss of identity, the Jewish identity, that was so strong in the first and second generation kind dissipated by the third and fourth generation, because as refugees, they were desperate to be accepted both in India and in Britain. They did get accepted, but their desperation to be part of the upper class and their aristocracy cost them the business. One of the things you'll learn from researching this book is actually in 110 years of archives of the family that I showed you, not once the question was raised, should we deal with A or B because of their religion or nationality or sect? Never, ever this comes up. It's always about, can we trust our counterpart? It's all really was about reputation and trust. David Sassoon hammered this issue into his children, kept saying, you know, on investments, you can lose, but you can remake it. But reputation, it's only once you lose it, you are doomed. This is an emblem of the family that was developed kind to be like the European aristocracy by the 1870s, 1880s. Remember, by then, the Sassoons were intermarrying with the Rothschilds, the Günzburg, the Polyakovs. So as you can see, the trust is emet ve'imuna at the top, which is, and in Latin, candida constante. And there are a lot of religious and home, you know, you can see the palm trees of, kind to remind them of their origins in Baghdad. One of the things that really, truly differentiated the Sassoons from many dynasties, past or present, is their focus on philanthropy. David Sassoon came up with the most innovative idea. In the books, the trading books in the archives, each trade is registered. So, for example, they bought a box of tea, a chest of tea. So you see the price of that chest, you see the cost of transfer, you see the maritime insurance. And then at the end of every trade, they added their own tax called either tzedakah or mitzvah, 1/4%. Now, 1/4% doesn't seem a high percentage, but if you think about it, that they were doing hundreds and sometimes thousands of trades. And the beauty of the system, this tax was charged irrelevant of whether the trade was profitable or not. So at the end of the year, there was a lot of money that was allocated to philanthropy. This blue synagogue still today exists. I took those pictures just before COVID in 2019. Actually, the Indian government renovated it about 10 years ago. It's a beautiful synagogue that's still being used. The one on, and David Sassoon built it. Then he started spending more time in Pune, which is about 4 hours away from Bombay, because it has less humidity. And the last few years he spent there. And he built this beautiful synagogue, I mean, stunning red brick. And actually, he's buried in the grounds there. That's really kind my quickly give you you know, my 20 minutes quick tour, so we can open it for questions and for discussions.
Perfect. So I want to start first with just a few questions here, and please do throw in your questions, those in the audience. In a few minutes, I'll invite you to open your cameras and then ask your questions live as well. But I just want to ask a few questions first. You called the book A Making of an Empire. What makes it an empire in your mind? What's the definition?
Well, look at this map. I mean, they were really in every part of the world. I know that in the US, they still don't understand why the US is not there, but you have to think of the US in 1830, 1840 versus the rest of the world. And of course, there was a civil war in the 1860s. So, but they were all over Europe, all over Asia, all over the Middle East, all over different parts. I mean, it is really remarkable how they spread all around and their contact. They, by the way, one of the mistakes that a lot of people who write about the Sassoons, the Sassoons were never in banking, were never money lenders, but sat on the boards of every major bank that was created. So the Bank of China, the Bank of Hindustan, the Imperial Bank of Persia, they sat on all those board members, and they were critical in the setup, and they sat on the board of HSBC, which was the main bank in Hong Kong and China for almost 45 years. So their reach was incredible. And just to tell you a little bit about where the empire comes from. I mean, when Abdullah, Sir Albert, moved to London, the British government would use him to entertain the Shah of Persia, or to broker some deal with the Sultan of Oman, who was in charge of Zanzibar. So their influence was really across the globe, at the time, at least.
And along that line, so they go to London because they threw their lot in with the British. They saw the importance of the British in that network.
Yeah. So it started really very simple. Part of the network, David Sassoon was the first merchant family in India to send a representative to London. And it was simply to gather information, because he thought that the city of London is becoming more critical, and the stock exchange was becoming the hub of all international financial transaction. The son goes there and begins to set up good networks and information, and it paid off. It is really amazing when you think about it today. But when the American Civil War broke out, if you lived in London and you had good contacts, you had much better information than if you were based in India. So the son would get information. Cotton prices were going crazy. The first year, cotton prices quadrupled. A lot of traders in India got into it, but then they filed bankruptcy because by the end of the war, prices went down. You had the new producers like Brazil or Egypt. But going back to your question, that son said, I need another brother because the business is expanding, and I need. So a second son goes there, then a third one, then a fourth one. And then that begins the interesting thing. The father has died. Abdullah or Albert is running the business from Bombay. But, it's hot in Bombay, it's monsoon, and they keep getting those letters about the good life in London and the countryside and the party with the Prince of Wales and the party with this one lord and that lord, and somehow must have felt, hey, why am I sitting here and not going there? And so he moved in 1872, 1873. Few stayed, like Farha and her husband, who was also a Sassoon. But really, the bulk moved there, and then intensively begin this, let's get titles. Albert's son becomes a member of parliament, having married the daughter of a Rothschild. So now you're in politics, now you are really, and of course comes the houses and the estate and the desperate attempt to be integrated fully at that level.
So I'm inviting everyone to return as panelists, just so you know. That doesn't mean that you're going to be giving the presentation. It just means that we're inviting you to open your cameras so we can have more of an open conversation. So please do, I'm going to invite you again, but many questions have come up, and it was going to be one of my questions a little later on, but I feel like we have to address it at this point. Opium. I think that's a word, is a concept.
Yeah.
So
I think that, and I write a lot about it in the book, I think that you need to look at it from the perspective of the mid-19th century and not from the 21st century. Let me just explain. And this is not a defense of the trade, but I'm trying to put that historical perspective. Number one, opium was a legal commodity until almost World War I. Until 1907, you can walk to any pharmacy in New York or London or Paris and say to the pharmacist that you have a headache or a stomach bug. And a lot of the times the pharmacist would recommend some opium. Second, it was the most important commodity worldwide for 25 years. It was quoted in every newspaper, no different from silver or gold. And third, I think you need to understand how people reacted. So in 1895, because of religious missionary pressures on the UK, on the British Parliament, an imperial inquiry was set up. It went on for 5 years. They interviewed something along like 20,000. Their publication sits on my shelf of 2,500 pages of interview, including literally hundreds of medical experts. Every medical expert that they interviewed gave them the same answer. If taken in a small amount, it's no different from you having a glass of whiskey. Of course, the minute they told the parliament, if you ban opium, you have to ban whiskey, you can imagine the reaction in the British Parliament. And so the final conclusion that all this has been exaggerated. Obviously, it was political and economic. Opium constituted 16% of the total revenues of India for a very long time. Every time also that the production from India went down, the Chinese produced more local opium. It's a complicated issue, but I don't think we can look at it with the eyes of 2023.
thank you. And then I'm going to read their questions first, even though I have my own. But could you please tell us a little bit about the family in the 20th century, including Victor, with regard to international politics and diplomacy? And really, we do encourage everyone to open their cameras.
Sure. So Victor was a fascinating character, and there is a long chapter about him. He moved the business from India to Shanghai in 1926. By then, all the commodities like textile, opium have died, and there is no such a business. And he moves to the real estate business. He built the first skyscraper in Shanghai, still exists. It's a beautiful building. It's a Fairmont Hotel today, has been totally renovated, but you can still see the plaque, the Sassoon building there. There is even a Sassoon presidential suite, which was his bedroom. That business booms. And by the 1936 Fortune magazine put him as the 6th wealthiest man in the world. all this changes dramatically and very quickly. 1937, there is the Japanese invasion of Shanghai, and that augurs what was going to come later on. He left Shanghai, prices began to drop. Then he returns, but he really did not believe that Asia and Japan are going to be in World War II. Big mistake. He stays there, manages to get out before the Japanese occupy fully Shanghai and Hong Kong, and basically interned Jewish families who were all British citizens, and he escaped. And rather than trying to redevelop the business, he starts touring the world, giving international talks, giving advice to every government about how to run the war and run post-war, starts talking that actually Brazil is really what Hitler's final prize is going to be, all kind of things. And so for 4 years, he drops the business. Of course, he comes back to Shanghai, business is decimated. Civil war now is going on between the nationalists and the communists, and he still doesn't accept that the end is coming. They try to liquidate, but there are no buyers. And if there are buyers, there are like around the 5 cents, 10 cents to the dollar. Anyway, this comes to a sad end in 1949 with the nationalization of all assets. And he left kind of a broken person, really, and he decides not to do any more business. He heads to the Bahamas. He also had medical problems because in World War I, his plane collapsed and he always had issues with his back and leg. And then he died in the Bahamas.
Thank you. So we know that this is a departure from your normal writing, and you had said that you didn't set out to write a history of your family or of the Sassoon family. What drew you to write this book?
Well, I tell the story. I mean, it's a weird thing. I had a fellowship in Oxford and I was sitting and working on authoritarianism when I received a letter from someone in Western Scotland called Joseph Sassoon. I was convinced it was a joke. I never really bothered, and it irritated me that there was no email and no telephone, which meant that I have to write now a letter. And anyway, connection was made with him. I spoke to him a lot on the phone. I ended up going and visiting him in Western Scotland, and that was really kind of the first time he started showing me pictures of his grandmother actually marrying in St. Petersburg, with all these beautiful furs and carriages. And I have to say, I was intrigued. Then he sent me to another Sassoon in London who worked on a family tree, and I went and saw her and spoke to her. And then I saw in a little footnote that there is something at the National Library in Jerusalem, and being in London, I thought I will go and check it. And that's really the turning point. When I walked in and I saw there are literally hundreds of thousands of these documents that no one has used, I realized there is a story to be told.
So the majority of that was in Jerusalem and the National Library?
All the correspondence is at the National Library in their archives, yes.
And that's mostly in what language?
In that language you saw.
In the Judeo-Arabic.
There is some in English, but it's amazing how much of it was kept. I mean, sometimes I felt like every scrap of paper, menus of dinners for VIPs, seating arrangements, diaries of a couple of small children, exercise books when they were learning to write, kept. The sad part in this, you really don't have the real diaries of adults telling you their feelings and what they, I mean, I would have loved to read a diary of either one of the two brothers about the emotions of that conflict with the brother. But you're facing, I see the will, I see the correspondence, I see a draft of agreements between the two brothers that never really reached its final destination. But unfortunately, we don't have a look at the emotions and the turbulence that was going on in a lot of other cases.
So we have a question here, if you know the origin of the name Sassoon.
As far as I know, it's a Hebrew name, which is Sassoon, is happiness, B'Sasson V'Simcha, as you know, that they sing it. Or so I have there is an area in Iran that is spelled still Sasun, and there is a tribe that called the Sassoonim, which still exists. Whether they were originally from there or not, as far as we know, they were in the Babylonian, that were captives and sent to during that time back to Babylon, and that's the history really going there. But I always thought it's coming from the Hebrew word.
Yeah, in medieval Spain, there is an Ibn Shoshan family, which is
That's right.
Ibn Susan. So I wonder if there's,
Well, it's interesting, one of the things you asked before about going to England, and so in total contrast to the first and second generation that were proud to be from Baghdad and to be Jewish, the fourth generation, they didn't like that emblem that I showed you because it had the Hebrew. They started saying they really don't want to be there, maybe from Toledo, because coming from Spain is a little bit more prestigious than coming from Baghdad, at least in their eyes. So there were all these efforts to change that. I don't think that is correct. I mean, look, people traveled. That's the other thing which we cannot disregard. It's fascinating because in the Baghdadi Jewish dialects, there are quite a number of words from Spanish, which does not exist, obviously, in the Muslim dialect or the literate Arabic. So, but then there are words from Hebrew, there are words from Persian, there are words from the Ottoman. Later on, even in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there are Hindu words that come in because of Indian soldiers coming to back. That's the change in a language. But everything is possible. I mean, there were open borders. They were really the real globalized people, where they traveled from one place to another, and they had contacts with different people in different parts of the world.
And if you talk about different parts of the world, another question here is that her husband's family was Sassoon, and they're from Mosul, and she wanted to know if you knew a big trading branch, wealthy merchants, in Mosul, if it's part of the same family.
No, I mean, look, in America, everyone thinks that we're connected to Vidal Sassoon. There is no connection to Vidal Sassoon. Vidal, actually, his family is from Aleppo. Today, there are many people whose first name is actually Sassoon. So you could have different families in different places with that name, but I don't know anything about a family in Mosul. Sorry.
All right. I also, I have to go back to Flora or Farhai. Just, you were talking about how the third and fourth generation started to leave the religion, and she was just so committed to her Judaism and so entrenched in it. Did her children also leave it?
No, they did not. Her son became the largest collector in the world of Hebraica. And he really did incredible. He traveled with her twice. And then while she was in Baghdad or one of those areas, he would go into all different parts. He was in Syria, in Yemen, and he would buy a lot of books in Hebrew, Bibles, scrolls. I don't know whether you're aware, but last Christmas, Christie had a huge auction of the Sassoons. And some of these items, I am assuming, were sold to museums, but one scroll of the Torah from Yemen was sold for $1 million. I mean, these are really 13th, 14th century that are very important. By the way, there is going to be a Sassoon exhibition at the Jewish Museum in New York from March through August.
That's exciting.
Okay, well, that should be interesting. I'm going to ask you a little bit of a personal question. Given your background and your history, did that have any influence on your career choice in terms of contemporary Arab studies?
No, I mean, look, this was really a diversion in a big way, because I had to learn about India, about China, about shipping, about opium that I didn't know anything about. I think it opened a lot of things, but my background, my real expertise is still in the contemporary Middle East. I haven't decided where to head next. There are a lot of interesting things, but I want to go back, because I did a disservice to the previous question you asked. Flora really was never given her proper place. I know that in Israel, she's today seen as one of the earliest feminists. But you're absolutely right. Her knowledge of the Bible, the Talmud, was really beyond belief. Plus, I don't know, 6, 7 languages. She used to quote from Shakespeare and the Torah and the Talmud by age 17, 18. She was, interestingly, the only woman and the first woman to address a Jews college in England, which ordained rabbis. And 70 years after its set up, she was invited. And I put a lot of her speech in the book, because she was incredible. She blasted them rather than say thank you. She said, let me understand. It says you need to be a special person to do this. Are you telling me in 70 years you could not find one able, capable woman to do this? I mean, how is that possible? And then her quotes from different religious sources was absolutely fascinating. But the bottom line was, whenever the men got in trouble, historically, going back through centuries, they always turned to a woman to help them solve their problems. And there was this thing of, when the Sassoon needed someone to run the business in Asia, they turned to me. But then when it was comfortable for them, they said, thank you, but no thank you.
And you do mention another woman, Rachel, the daughter of Sassoon David.
Yeah, so that's an interesting, part of really what happens to the fourth generation, and this is a story not just of the Sassoons, but a lot of dynasties, you need two things to continue a dynasty. You need talent and you need interest in business. I mean, you can be super talented, but not interested in the business. And within the Sassoons, there are two characters in the book that obviously are very talented. Rachel Beer Sassoon, who ended up being the first woman editor of a national newspaper. I don't think in the United States we had a woman editor until the 1970s, 80s. But you have to understand, women were not allowed at the time to vote. And yet, at some point, she was in charge of the two biggest and most important national newspapers in Britain. And she really, actually, part of her rise to prominence was how she wrote about the Dreyfus affairs and what was going on. Another talented person who was totally not connected to the family and didn't want to be in any way connected to it is the famous World War I poet Siegfried Sassoon, who's actually still taught in the curricula in Britain, but here, unless people are doing World War I or English literature, they don't know about him. But he was an incredible, incredible poet. But unfortunately, there was no connection anymore to the, he carried the name Siegfried Sassoon, but apart from that, you know, his first name tells you a lot of what was going on.
Did they, when they got to England, did they make connections with the Sephardim that were there already, the Bevis Marx community, the Spanish Portuguese community, or did they stay in their own enclosed world?
I mean, there were these synagogues that they were attending, the Portuguese and others, but I think they saw themselves, you know, close to the, I mean, their relationship with the royal family is absolutely fascinating. It started already in India, and then it continued when they came to England. And then when he became king, that relationship continued. And actually, even with his children. So I think that they were mesmerized by the fact that, you know, in fact, one of the Sassoons, you know, there is a book of who enters the royal palace, and it turned out he was the number 2 for about 10 years, going in and out. You know, I think that this dominated and started getting different titles. They really wanted to be, you know, Philip Sassoon, who another Sassoon who was really not interested in the business, was one of an art connoisseur. He was head of the National Gallery. I mean, this was a very, very prestigious, very, very British.
As a Jew? Like,
sorry?
He was Jewish. He didn't convert. He was
Jewish. I mean, he never exercised, you know, practiced or anything. And he also was involved. He was a member of parliament, and at some point he was appointed undersecretary for the Air Force in the 1920s. But again, he was one of those that he really didn't want to hear or know anything about the Sassoons or their origins.
Valerie or Harriet, do you want to open your microphones for your questions? I see there's a hand raised from Valerie, and Harriet, if you want to ask your question. Valerie?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh dear.
We can hear you.
Okay, maybe we should type it in. Harriet, do you want to open your microphone in the meantime while Valerie is trying to get that? Okay, I thought it would be nice if we did, but we might have to see. I just want to go to the point also about the Rothschilds of the East and how that started or how that plays in and what you see at that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. It's there is a wonderful editorial in one of the papers in Hong Kong that actually says who is the is it the Rothschild or the East or the Sassoons of the West? I mean, the reality, if you look at the 19th century, and that was really the point of the article, the Rothschilds were not known at all in the Far East. It was the Sassoons. I think that tag went on really when they moved to Britain. And by the way, even then, although the Rothschild had a huge influence, in many ways, I argue in the book that the Sassoons were better accepted in the British society than the Rothschilds, and there are a number of reasons. One, they were not in the money lending business, so the anti-Semitic aspect of, money lenders didn't apply. Two, the British never liked, the nouveau riche, the people coming up, and they felt that applied to the Rothschilds, while the Sassoons were already merchant princes in India, and before that were one of the most prominent in Baghdad. And last but not least, there was the issue toward the beginning of the 20th century and end of 19th century with wars in Europe. The Rothschilds, there was always a question: where does the loyalty lie? Is it with the brother in London, or his cousin in Germany, or the other brother in France? With the Sassoon, it was very simple. It was all British, and as a result, for example, their reputation
I can't hear it at all.
Sorry.
No,
their reputation was
No, it's on.
untarnished, or there was no attacks on the Sassoon during the war about their loyalty.
Thank you. I saw Harriet came back, and Valerie, I just want to give them one more chance. Okay, well, send in the questions if you have extra questions. We want to be mindful of our time. And we look forward to continuing the conversation, because this is a lot there to unpack. So thank you very much, Professor Sassoon. We really